do the leadership from our economics club gonna give just a quick plug for the club, and that we've been this talk tonight has been sponsored and organized by our club. Do you want to say a couple quick words about the club, or
Jesse, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So I'm Jesse, the president of the Economics Emeritus Inequality Club. I'm here with Nina Kravitz, who's our VP. I'll be moderating Q&A later this session, and I think Nina's going to close out. Today, excuse me, Fabian, if you could just mute your mic, that would be much appreciated. Today we're here with Dr. Richard Wolff, known to be a critic of our modern capitalist system. And for the most part, he'll be here for the next 30, 45 minutes or so talking to us about aspects of socialism and Marxism that may provide better benefit to all of us. So.
Okay, thank you. Thank you and welcome to everybody. I'm Professor Kenneth Levin. Good evening and welcome to our seminar. This is we've had a few seminars this semester and we hope to have more next semester, and be on the lookout through our club for all the exciting events that they've been organizing, and it's become more and more popular even in the last couple of years over Zoom and in person as well. Just a reminder everybody to be sure to mute yourself. We're first going to have a talk from Professor Wolff, and then we're going to have, you can unmute yourself as you want to give, if you have questions or comments. I'm going to say a couple words about Professor Wolff and then leave him with the floor. So let me just take a couple minutes here to tell you a little bit about his background for those who aren't as familiar as others. So our speaker tonight is one of the most visible public economists in our country. He's the founder of Democracy at Work and host of their nationally syndicated show, Economic Update. Professor Richard Wolff became a national figure as an important voice during the Occupy Wall Street uprising, and currently he appears on many podcasts and all over social media, but also interviews regularly on major television network news and talk shows. He's written many articles and has published a long list of books that you will definitely want to read. His latest book, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself, can be found along with his other books, most recently Understanding Socialism and Understanding Marxism at www.democracyatwork.info. Professor Wolff has a bulletproof academic pedigree, completing his undergraduate studies at Harvard with graduate work done at both Stanford and Yale. The bulk of his teaching career was spent in Amherst at the University of Massachusetts. The sweeping range of his scholarly work, much of it together with Professor Stephen Resnick, makes him one of the most holistic economists you will encounter. That's right, he has published on everything from the impact of colonialism and East African development to social theory and methodology, issues of race, class, and gender in the environment, to our national debt and monetary and fiscal policy, the European Union, to the history of economic thought and the history and breakup of the Soviet Union, with much more to say than just that. Today, he is one of the most sought after speakers in the field of economics. So you might ask, why do we think we could get him to join us here tonight? I can let you in on a little secret. Professor Wolff really likes BMCC students. How do I know? My understanding is that Professor Wolff actually made a conscious decision early in his career to leave, this is a true story, to leave Yale University in order to teach at City College here in New York due to their open admissions policy. In fact, his first wave of graduate students in Amherst had been entirely from CUNY undergraduates. Tonight represents a kind of homecoming to CUNY. It is my extreme privilege and sincere pleasure to welcome Professor Richard Wolff.
Thank you very much, Ken. And what the story you just told, I can confirm is 100% true and accurate. I did make a decision that after spending 10 years of my life in the fanciest schools America has, in the Ivy League, Harvard and Yale, I made a clear decision that 10 years was enough, and I didn't want to stay there or go back there ever again. And except for short visits, I've kept to that commitment and taught mostly in public institutions. And one of the reasons I'm glad to be at BMCC is precisely because you are a public institution, and public institutions are what ought to be doing all of the education here in the United States. And let me start with a story on just that point. My family is by origin French. My father was born in France. I was born here in Ohio in the United States, but my father was French. And so I've been speaking French all my life. I go back there as often as I can. In France, basically all of the higher education is public. If you ask French people, why don't you have private universities? They look at you with a funny glance and they say, why should we do that? Because if you have private and public, then the private will be where the people with the money go, and the public will be what's left for everybody else. And that's not consistent with democracy, so we're not going to do that in our country. You might also be interested to know, because it touches on my theme tonight, that in France, it doesn't cost anything to go to a public college or university. Let me do that again, just in case you didn't hear me. There is a small fee. It's about 200 euros. Oh, so say maybe 250 bucks, either per semester or per year. That's it. No tuition, no fees per courses, nothing. You go to a university in France, you pay for your room and board, which you would have had to do anyway, but you do not pay for your higher education. And in case you're wondering, there are 7 other countries in Europe that are the same. Germany, the biggest and most powerful, being among them. But there's 6 others too. And if you ask them, why do you make higher education free? They again look at you with this funny look. How could you ask such a question? Their answer is simple. Educating our young people makes us a better country, a better society. It gives more people the education that enables them to make bigger and better contributions throughout their lives. So it's good for everyone, and therefore the government picks up the cost of higher education. The next time you hear someone tell you about how here we in the United States have the best system there ever is, don't believe it. It hasn't been true for a long time. So let me get to my basic topic. I learned a lot of economics at Harvard and Stanford and Yale. I don't deny it. I'm glad I learned what I learned. And I've put it to what I think is good use, analyzing the economic system out of which Harvard, Stanford, and Yale have grown. And we all have. And I've drawn a conclusion across my lifetime. I've taught at the City University of New York, the University of Massachusetts. I teach right now at the New School University in New York City. I've lectured at the Sorbonne, the University of Paris in France, and so on. I don't think capitalism, the system we have, is the best system human beings can devise. I think we can do better, and I'm going to try in the next 25 minutes to give you evidence of how and why we can do better. And I'm going to use the United States because that's where I've grown up and lived all my life, and that's where you are, so that's the best example I think I can use. Capitalism has 3 particular qualities that have been a big, fat problem throughout its history. The first one, not in order of importance, but the first one is inequality. Inequality. What do I mean? Well, you know what I mean, so I'm not going to take a lot of time. A few very rich people, an enormous number of poor people, and then a shaky in-between middle, real worried that it might not be middle all that much longer. To give you just a couple of statistics, the richest 400 or 500 people, 400 or 500 people, total population of the world today, a little over 7 billion. So a few hundred people have more wealth than half of the rest of the population. Here in the United States, the 100 richest people have more wealth than the bottom 80% of us have together. We live in a society whose inequality, you have to go back to the ancient Egypt and the pyramids to get something like that. Elon Musk, some of you know who that is, the CEO at Tesla Automobile, or Jeffrey Bezos, the CEO at Amazon. These are people who have in their own personal possession $200 to $300 billion. That's more wealth than many countries around the world possess. That's more money than you and I can imagine, which is why when I say it, I don't spend a lot of time because people can't get their heads around this. It's a very peculiar society that makes some people so rich. Well, let me use Mr. Musk and Mr. Bezos. A few weeks ago, if you were watching the news, you would have seen them competing about which of them gets to ride for a few minutes in a rocket ship that costs hundreds of millions of dollars. Those are toys for them. You and I will never see anything like that in our lifetimes. If we added up our entire lives' income together, we couldn't dream of what they do without thinking about it. Not all societies allow that kind of inequality. We do. Capitalism produces it. Capitalism is the system that governs in the world today, and capitalism therefore gets the responsibility for a stupefying level of inequality. And it's gotten worse over the last 40 years, much worse. At the end of World War II, the United States was a less unequal country than most of Europe. Today, we are a much more unequal country than most of Europe. To go back to a comparison like the one I made with telling you about how Europe does not require people to pay for higher education. You know what that does? That saves all of their middle class and their working class. They don't have the need to borrow huge amounts of money that become a weight on them for the rest of their lives to go to college. They don't get that benefit of capitalism. And you know why? Because in those countries, socialist political parties and socialist labor unions fought for free education. Let me give you a couple other ideas of what you can't do in Europe that you can in the United States. I'm going to use France as an example simply because I know that country best, but I could give you examples from other countries. Here's the law in France, and it's been the law for many decades. After you graduate from high school or college and you enter the labor force, the law in France requires your employer to give you every year 5 weeks of paid vacation. Yeah. Again, next time you hear about we're in America, we have the best. No, we don't. We're not even close. You know how much paid vacation the law requires in this country? 0. You're not required to do anything. Some employers do, but it's not the law. Here's another example. If you have a child in France, the government immediately assigns you a social worker for the first 6 to 12 months to help you with a new baby. And you know who pays for the social worker? The government does. And that person's supposed to help you cook, do your laundry, do your shopping, the real practical things that new parents need help with. Do we have a program in this country like that? No. In France, it's the law. If you have a new baby, you get maternity leave for the mother and paternity leave for the father for months, and you'd be paid your full wage and salary. We don't have any of that. You know why? Because in those countries, powerful socialist trade unions and socialist political parties got those things. And if this is news to you, that's not your fault. It's because the newspapers, the mainstream media in this country do not cover this material. You can go find it on the internet. It's no big secret, but it's never part of the conversation. I won't embarrass you, but I'm going to take two countries. One is called Germany and one is called Portugal. Those are two countries been in Europe for centuries. Let me tell you something you didn't know, unless you're very unusual American. The current government in Portugal was elected in 2016 and re-elected with an even larger majority last year in 2020. The government of Portugal is a coalition of 3 political parties that agreed to work together because they had together the majority of the votes. Number 1, the Portuguese Socialist Party. Number 2, the Portuguese Communist Party. And number 3, the Portuguese Green Party. That's the government of Portugal, and it's been that way for the last 5.5 years. You didn't know that, I would guess. I won't embarrass anyone. Don't have to raise your hand. How many of you are aware that 3 weeks ago there was a national election in Germany, the big powerhouse economy in Europe, the most important economy in Europe? If you were aware, then maybe you know, although I guess you probably don't, who the winner was. What political party in Germany got the most votes? Let me tell you, the German Socialist Party is now the government of Germany. What's going on shouldn't surprise you. Most European countries have 5, 6, or 7 political parties. When you go into the voting area, you have real freedom of choice, lots of choice. When you go into this country, you don't. You get to choose Republican and Democrat, and you all know how hard it is to tell the difference. We've tried to fix capitalism in this country many times, but it hasn't worked. We tried to do something about this difference between a few super rich people and massive poverty. It hasn't worked. You all know because you live in New York just like I do. I live in Manhattan. And when I go for a loaf of bread or to buy a quart of milk, I step over homeless people, just like you do. An economic system is measured by how well it provides at least the basics: food, clothing, and shelter. Shelter, homes. You got to pay people enough money so they can afford to live in an apartment. You either have to pay them enough or you have to bring the price down. And if you don't do that, you fail as an economic system. We have, depending on how you count, millions of homeless people in this country. That is an economic failure. Here's another one. Instability. our economic system is stunningly unstable. What do I mean? Every 4 to 7 years, we have an economic crash, a recession, a depression, a downturn. Every 4 to 7 years. By the way, in this new century, we've had 3. The so-called dot-com crash in 2000, the so-called Great Recession in 2008, and now in 2020, last year in this, the so-called COVID recession. 21 years, 3 recessions, right on time, every 4 to 7 years. And you know what happens each time? Millions of people lose their job. Millions of businesses go bankrupt. That's why if you walk down any major avenue in New York, you will see an amazing number of stores that are empty and have been empty for months or years. That's not an effective economic system. We can do better than all of that. I want to now answer the question, why? Why do all these things and many more that I could talk about, why are they happening? Why do the socialists have powerful political parties and labor unions in every other capitalist country in Europe and much beyond there? And we don't. What's going on? Well, we have an economic system that's organized in a very peculiar way. I want you to think about how peculiar it is, rather than taking it for granted. Here's how we organize enterprises. In other words, I mean, how do we organize producing goods and services? The hat you're wearing, the software you're using, the hamburger you're eating, whatever. We organize a very strange way. We have a small number of people, 2%, maybe 3%, and we call them employers. Employers. And then we have a huge number of people who we call employees. And there's a big difference. The employers give the orders. They tell you when you get to work, whether you're in a factory or an office or a store. When you get to work, the employer tells you where to go, what to do, what work to do, how to, sorry. When you go to work, an employer tells you where to stand, what to do, what tool to use, what work to do, how long to do it, how long to sit there, how long you can have for lunch, and when you have to go home so that you can get a beer, a pizza, and come back the next morning and do it all again. You're not in charge. And there's an interesting thing about it. All the work you do, that you pour your brains and your muscles in, at the end of the day, you leave that work where you made it. You leave, but you don't take the work with you, because if you do, people in dark blue uniforms will come to your house and they will hurt you. So you know not to do that. You work, you pour yourself, your skill, your ability, and it belongs as fast as you make it to somebody else. You know who? The employer. The vast majority of employees do the work that is taken by a very small minority. Some of you ought to have a little light go off in your head at this point, because this way of organizing things has a scary similarity to the ancient world. You all heard about slavery. In slavery, there's a tiny group of people called the masters and a large group of people called the slaves. And the slaves do all the work. And the masters get the results of that work, keep a big fat part of it for themselves, and give the slaves just enough to keep them going. Maybe you've heard about feudalism. We have lords and serfs, pretty much the same system. Guess what? Capitalism isn't so different from them, is it? A small group of people, those who own General Motors, General Electric, and all the other companies, large and small, tiny minority of Americans. The vast majority have been, are now, and unless things change, will be employees. And why is that important? Because the way business is organized, the people at the top, the employers, do everything that they can to give as little money as possible to the employees so as to keep as much as possible profits for themselves. Profit is what drives capitalism. That's by the way, why so many jobs have disappeared in America, because it was easier to move them to China or India or Brazil, because you can pay workers less there than you have to pay them here. So they moved big time over the last 30 years, which is why the jobs you had to look forward to are nothing like what they once were. You know what else they did to save money on workers? We call it automation. They replaced them with machines, computers, robots, artificial intelligence. And another way to lower the wages, bring immigrants, particularly poor ones, who might be willing because they're desperate to work for less. It's not a pretty picture. Meanwhile, the profits, of course, go up because they don't have to pay workers the way they once had to. And as the profits go up, the small number of Americans who get profits become richer, and the rest of us don't. And that's why the inequality that I spoke to you about 20 minutes ago is as bad as it is. Look, I'm going to be very honest with you. If you run a system in which a tiny group of people, 1 or 2%, sit at the top of every enterprise, every factory, every store, every office, telling everybody else what to do and getting all the product, then you really can't be surprised that they run these enterprises to make them rich, not you. It's a system of, by, and for those who sit at the top, the employer class of people. And therefore the solution, and in these remaining 5 minutes that I have, I'm going to tell you what the solution is. The solution to a system that works like this, that has the problems I've just sketched briefly for you, the solution can't be another law or electing Mary instead of John. We're beyond that. That's like putting a Band-Aid when the doctor has told you, no, you got cancer. You got to do something more than Band-Aid. You can't just wash your hands. You've got to make a bigger change if you're going to win this thing, if you're going to get through. We need a bigger change. And here's the one I propose, and nor am I the only one. We got to go to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is how we have organized business in this country. We've allowed a system that is grotesquely undemocratic. A tiny group of people at the top of virtually every enterprise, the employers. In a big corporation, it's called the board of directors. Yeah, usually 12, 15 people. That's all a board of directors is. They make all the decisions. They decide what gets produced, how it gets produced, what technology will be used, and they then decide what to do with the revenue they get when they sell the work you did for them during your 8-hour day. We can't be surprised if that tiny group of people makes the system work for them. If we want the economic system to work for the people, then the people have to be in charge. And here's what I mean. We can organize businesses differently. What do I mean? Well, I like the word democracy. I hope most of you do too. One person, one vote. We do that to decide who's the mayor. We do that to decide who's in the Congress or the Senate. We do it in politics, but for some strange reason, we don't do it in economics. Why not? If it's good in politics, I got a thought for you. Might be good in economics too. We might have a democratic decision. And guess what? If we had one person, one vote in an enterprise, you think they would give hundreds of millions of dollars to the 2 or 3 people at the top while the rest of us can't send our kid to college? Wouldn't happen. Wouldn't happen. You want to finally do something about the grotesque inequality, change the way the businesses are run. And by the way, they have a name. In this country, it's called a worker co-op. It's a group of people getting together saying, we want a democratic way of running a business. We all want to get together to decide, yeah, maybe some of us get more money than others to help pay for an education, to help handle a larger family, a lot of good reasons. But they have to be discussed, they have to be worked out, and then we have to vote to see what we would like as a community working in this store or this office or this factory. There are worker co-ops all over the United States, and they are all over the rest of the world. This is not a new idea. This is not something that fantasy, maybe someday in the distant future. No. It exists now. And you know why? Because people have figured out what I am telling you. I'm not the first one, not by a long shot. But things have gotten so bad in the United States, so bad, that more and more people are coming to a recognition that we have accepted a capitalist system that produces and reproduces problems. It doesn't solve them. I'll end with one that you all know about and think about. Once upon a time here in the United States, half the country was capitalist and the other half was slavery. The American South, white masters, black slaves. Things got so bad, we had the worst war in American history, the Civil War in the 1860s. That war emancipated the black slaves, was supposed to be a way to move forward in a society. Slavery was destroyed, and capitalism became the system. And here we are, 150 years later, and we still have to find large numbers of Americans believing that white supremacy is something other than a bad joke, that we still have institutionalized racism. This is something that capitalism has not only not solved, but is a good argument, it's made it worse. I could go on, but the basic message I want you to understand. I used the economics I learned at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. But my professors would have preferred I use it on something other than asking questions about the system we live in. I disappointed them. I asked those questions. I've asked them all my life. And as I was saying to Jesse before we went on, I'm more of a critic of capitalism now than I was when I was in the university, because capitalism's performance since then has confirmed my worst fears about where it's going and how it's developing. Let me close with 2 things you must understand as a kind of summary. Here's the first one, and then I'll stop. You all know that we've been fighting the COVID virus for 2 years, roughly, and we're not out of the woods yet. What is the story of how the United States, as the world's major capitalist economy, how did it do? Well, Americans comprise 4.5% of the population of this planet. But we also account for roughly 16% of the deaths from COVID on this planet. We are a super rich country with a well-developed medical system. But our performance on this virus is a disaster, much poorer than many other countries. 59% of Americans are vaccinated. 89% of Cubans in Cuba are vaccinated. On a per capita basis, the United States has 3 times the death rate that Cuba, one of the poorer countries in the world, has. What is going on here? Over the last 12 months, 42 million Americans got help through food stamps. Not only do we have millions of people for whom this system provides no home, the homeless, but we have 42 million people that need help to get enough food, and over half of those people are children in families. This system is busted. And the real question I want to leave you with, your generation, you have a risky decision to make. Either you change this system, or you risk being taken down with it. Let me stop there and see if any of you have questions about anything that I have said, didn't say, and I'm more than happy to have people disagree with me, so don't hesitate.
Thanks for the wonderful talk, Professor. I see a couple hands coming up right now, and we actually have a couple submissions that have already come in. So I'll pass the mic to Josh Mulov, our first entry. He has a question regarding workplace democracy. So Josh, if you want to unmic and fire away.
Yes, hello. Hi, Professor Wolff. Just want to say I love you, love your work. But my question is in regards to workplace democracy. I'm just wondering if in like a market socialist society, the tendency for the rate of profit to fall would still exist given like the competition between these firms. And if so, how would workplace democracy solve the crisis of overproduction inherent to market-based economies?
Good question.
Very good. Great question. Thank you for presenting it. Let me try to respond. I think the best way, I mean, it's a huge question, and you know, I've written about it. It's a long conversation, but to get to at least one key point, a worker co-op based economy is different from capitalism, not only because a small group of people will no longer be in their undemocratic control situation because it will be a democratic workplace, but because of that, the logic of capitalism won't apply anymore. The key point in the logic of capitalism is profit. If you talk to the executive of any American corporation, he or she will tell you profit is our bottom line. Profit is what we're in business to get. Profit is what we look to when making decisions about growing or not growing or moving or not. In other words, it's a profit-driven system, which makes perfect sense because the vast employees, they don't get profits, they get wages. It's the tiny group of owners and people who run the enterprise, employers, they're the ones that get the profit. So of course, in their system, you maximize profit. but not in a worker co-op. So if profits go down, that's an interesting fact. We'll take that into consideration because it means we won't have the extra money that a bigger profit might have given us to solve certain problems. But we're not here just to make profits. I'll give you a very concrete example. In our community, profits is not the only thing. Childcare is important. We can't have the adults who want to come to work able to come to work if there's nothing being done to take care of their children. So in this factory or this office or this store, one of the things we're going to do as a community is to provide childcare. That's something we do that benefits the community. And in that way, benefits us, because if we provide good quality childcare, more people will be able and willing to come and work at whatever it is we do. So we will give up profits in order to have a daycare center. We will give up some profits in order to have less pollution in the air because it makes us go to the doctor less frequently. In other words, a worker co-op, a democratic workplace, has a different set of objectives, a different set of goals. It doesn't prioritize profits. It isn't driven by maximizing profits, and in that way is fundamentally different from a capitalist organization and would not react with panic if the profit rate goes down, so long as other aspects it was trying to achieve are going up so that it balances out. Every system develops its own rules to reproduce itself. You can't apply the rule of profit to a worker co-op because it's a different system.
Thorough answer there. I think next we have a question from Daniel Abramson, and after that, Professor Levin.
Hello, Professor.
Hi.
Thank you for coming to give the speech because I've been following you on your YouTube career. So I've been a fan of your work. But my main question deals with the terminology coined by Cedric Robinson, the late Cedric Robinson, which is racial capitalism. And my one issue with co-ops, which I am in favor for and think are a logical next step in transforming the economy, is America's peculiar history of using violence to suppress co-ops, because it has been many times at the most extreme levels, massacres, whenever a co-op managed to be successful in a capitalist market. So though that has been in the last century primarily, there are still threats, as you said within your speech about white supremacy, not being something of the past, but quite present. So my question to you, sir, is how do we deal with the illegality of vigilante violence upon successful co-ops that are usually encouraged by the ignorance and apathy of the police, who either engage in that vandalism or simply ignore it?
All right, first of all, you're absolutely right. There is a long history of violence, particularly in the United States. I want to remind you that the Civil War achieved the end of slavery by force and violence, and that the capitalist part of the United States used force and violence to destroy the slave system of the South. And I want you to also understand how revolutionary it was when Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation and declares every slave free. He is declaring war on slavery, because it meant every slave owner who had spent money to buy the slaves he owned now discovered that he didn't own them anymore. This is called taking away your property. The capitalist North took away the property of the slave owners in one act. And by the way, did they compensate them? No. Did they give them money to compensate them for the loss of their slave? No. They were overthrown. The next time you hear some American talk about how there shouldn't be violence over there, wonder to yourself how you get to say something that you yourself do not honor in your own history. Having said that, yeah, I think there will be all kinds of cases where worker co-ops get formed and they threaten the classic capitalist enterprises who will not hesitate, I think you're right, to use violence against them if they think they can get away with it. But let me tell you very briefly that there have been very successful institutions of worker co-ops who have gotten around that problem, sometimes by self-defense, having their own people defend their worker co-ops, and sometimes by reaching political accommodations. I'm going to give you two examples just because we don't have time. The biggest worker co-op in the world is in Spain, in the northern mountain areas of Spain that are on the border, the Pyrenees Mountains that separate Spain from France. There's a medium-sized city there called Mondragon in the north of Spain. In 1956, very poor part of Spain, by the way. In 1956, there was a Catholic priest. Spain is a Catholic country, and you know everybody's Catholic there pretty much. And there was a Catholic priest in this city of Mondragon who gave a famous speech in 1956 to his parish, his Catholic parish. And it was a kind of a funny speech. He said, you know, everybody around here is unemployed and we're very poor. But you know, if we wait for some capitalist, some employer to come here and give us jobs, well, we'll all die of old age before that happens. And everybody laughed because they knew the truth of it. And then he surprised everybody and he said, let's not wait. Let's do without an employer. Let's become our own employer. In other words, let's set up a worker co-op. And so he did, led by the priest and protected, interestingly, by the church in that part of Spain. They started with 6 workers, a co-op. Now, fast forward to today, roughly 70 years later, something called the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation is a family of 250 worker co-ops. They're all together under one corporate umbrella. They are, get ready, the 7th largest corporation in all of Spain. They have over 120,000 workers. They are the world's biggest, most successful worker co-op. Here's a couple things they've done that you might be surprised at. They passed a rule, because they make all decisions democratically. The best paid worker cannot get more than 8 times the lowest. Here in the United States, the ratio between the top salary in a corporation and the bottom is around 350 to 1, not 8 to 1. Guess what? Nobody in Mondragon is on the street homeless. I've been to Mondragon. I looked for them. I couldn't find them. They don't allow extremes, neither on the rich end nor on the poor end. Here's another thing you might find funny. Twice a year, they have a meeting of all the workers where the workers vote on whether to keep the supervisors. They have supervisors. But notice, if you've ever worked in America, you know it's the supervisors who fire the workers, not in a co-op. If you got those workers upset, if you weren't friendly, if you weren't supportive, if you were the kind of supervisor we all know are out there, you're fired. And you know who fires you? Not the people above them, the people below, because they have the final say. Here's my second example. The
Excuse
Italian,
me, Professor Wolff.
Sorry,
I don't mean to cut you off. Sorry, but we do have we have 3 others who would like to ask questions, and our time is running a
good.
bit
No,
low.
you're right.
I
Let's
do
go
love
to
the
that.
example of the Spanish co-op, though. It seems like the answer is mass participation and general practice of checks and balances on power for those who are in, positions of power. So that was something I really didn't know. But just to future question askers, if you keep your questions a bit succinct, I know that this topic can be really dense. It can be taken to many different directions. So just that way everyone can ask their question. Professor Levin, I think you're next.
Okay. Yeah. I just was interested, it's very quite powerful, this idea of a workplace democracy and what each individual unit can do. But I think in some of your earlier works, you emphasize a lot like the political potential of what happens in a society when these workplace democracies prevail. In other words, when they are the dominant way in society that production is done and way business is operated, in terms of trying to deal with all of the other massive sort of macro problems that we have in terms of, race and gender issues and the environment and, the massive, there's $85 trillion in debt, and dealing with these, the capitalism is a complex ecosystem that needs to be reconstructed kind of after the Civil War, after they ended slavery. They needed to really reconstruct the society, and the potential of having these workplace democracies in leveraging that wealth and power in the economy to make the massive political changes in all the areas in the society.
Yeah, no, I agree. And my short, and I apologize, but my short answer would be, you're no longer going to have a political system torn apart by the difference between the rich minority and the mass of employees. I mean, every single senator, representative, mayor is torn between the demands that come from those who have the money to pay for their party, to pay for their candidacy, to hire the lobbyists that do all the work, and the mass of people can't compete. This is a situation which explains why poll after poll shows most Americans want something that the Congress doesn't do, that the state legislature doesn't do. And we shouldn't scratch our heads. There's no mystery here. It's because the people with the money, without which you cannot succeed politically, want the government to do one thing, and the mass of us want to do something else. But we don't have the money unless we get ourselves all together. Then we have, if we get all the people together and each of us gives $10, we're home free. But that's the big problem. The left isn't organized. The mass of people aren't organized, or even worse, they think the political choice is between the Republicans and the Democrats, not understanding that both of them have long ago been bought and paid for, with a few exceptions, by the same group of employers. If you're a big corporation in America, you give to both parties to get covered no matter who wins the election, because you've made sure that nobody who talks like me, for example, is out there running for office. And look what a hard time Ocasio-Cortez and the few others that are beginning to try to go in a different direction, they are having a hard time. But I think you're going to see a completely new political landscape when these worker co-ops, because they're going to have to decide democratically what they want their elected representatives. It isn't going to be the employer pushes in one direction and the employees in another, because you've gotten rid of that division. You've made the employees their own boss, and that's going to change everything.
Great, thank you. Next we have Aaron Cespedes, and again, this is last call for questions, guys. I don't know if Professor Wolff, I don't know if you mind just staying a few minutes extra.
Sure.
Some students seem to be pretty engaged. So Aaron, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, hi, Professor. Again, thank you for coming and doing this. I appreciate the things that you've been saying, but my question would be, like, when it comes to student loan debt and the idea of like forgiving the student loan debt, what kind of benefits will we see for the economy if something like student loan debt was forgiven?
Okay, good. The list is so long, I'm going to just pick 2 or 3 big ones to talk to you about. All right. College people, if they had their loans forgiven, particularly the younger ones, are an absolutely crucial time in their lives. People just finishing college or people just, a few years out. That's the age at which you make major career decisions. That's most of us, not all, but most. That's when you make decisions about, are you going to get married? Are you going to have children? Are you going to, fill in the blank? What we have now is a generation of people so loaded up with debt that they can't make rational life decisions because they're wondering how they're going to ever pay these debts back, how they're going to ever collect enough money to do that while trying, say, to start a career or to start a relationship with a family, et cetera, et cetera. We are holding people back on a scale that is criminal. Every idiot knows that if you can choose a career that you love, that means something to you, that excites your passion, you're going to do better work than if you don't. But we're telling a whole generation, you can't go where your passion is because you won't make enough money doing that. And you've got this loan, which is going to crush you. So you better put aside what you love and go hopefully get something that will give you enough money to get out of the debt trap you've been trapped in. We would have a completely different economic system, literally, if the people who are young and carrying these absurd levels of debt didn't have to. Number 2, these young people, when they do get a job, have to take a ridiculous portion of their income and not spend it on goods and services, which would give other people jobs. No. They have to pay back the loan, which doesn't give anybody a job. It's not a purchase of anything. It's just repaying the people who, and they're very wealthy, lent money into the student loan program. So this is not a good thing for the economy. This is a diversion of large sums of money away from buying goods and services to servicing a debt that shouldn't have been there in the first place. Here's the third one. A growing number of young people, and the statistics are very clear in America, facing the cost of higher education and the burden of a loan, are deciding the worst way of all. They're not going to college. They can't stand the idea of that debt. They've seen their older brother, sister, cousin, uncle working under that debt, so they don't go. They don't develop their own capabilities. That's not good for them as individuals. It's not good for their families, and it's terrible for the United States. The economics profession teaches that we are all competing now in a world economy. And the single most important thing each country can do is to develop the quantity and the quality of their educated labor force. We are destroying our future as a nation by persuading people with this crazy debt not to go to college, not to continue their education, because they can't stand the absurd debt that they're trapped into if they want a proper education. You know what that means? It means that the United States is a capitalist system that's busy shooting itself in the foot, destroying its own future because it can't cope with the problem of the debts that it has now loaded up. Let's be real clear, folks. Americans impose debt of 4 kinds. We are laboring under 4 mountains of debt. The first mountain is mortgage debt, the debt we have to go into to get housing because we don't pay people enough to buy a home. We have to make them go to the bank and borrow to get a home. Mortgage debt. Number 2, automobile debt. Number 3, credit card debt. And number 4, student debt. We are the most indebted capitalist system in the world, friend. You want a case where the United States is ahead? There we are. We're ahead. Yeah. In just the way you don't want to be. It is a terrible burden on this society. And if you relieved it, you would give a boost to our economy that you would be amazed to see as it ramifies through.
Great, great. Next we have Brunel, and then following that, Gerard.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask questions to the intervener. My question is, most people are like me. I always blame the free market because of inequality and discrimination. I know that capitalism is not working, and then logic is profit. The topic is the crisis of US capitalism. I observe when the capitalism is increased, capitalism has the capacity, has the ability to reproduce itself, to renew itself. What happened? Is this a socialism out of ID, a face capitalism? I would like to know.
I had a little difficulty hearing because at least at my end, the question faded in and out and I missed portions of, I'm sorry, but other questions I didn't have that problem.
You explain the logic of capitalism is profit.
Yes.
Most people blame the capitalism because of inequality and discrimination all the time. The second thing, capitalism has the opportunity or has the ability, the capacity to renew itself or to reproduce itself in the crisis. What happened? What about socialism? Is this a socialism out of ideas face to capitalism?
Okay, let me, I'm still not sure I've understood, but let me try. First, I agree with you that capitalism has been very successful over the last 350 years to renew itself, to overcome a series of crises, no question. But I want to remind you of a history. Every system has that capacity. Slavery, in the centuries when it was the dominant system in many parts of the world, overcame successive crises, found ways to renew itself. If it couldn't get slaves from one place, it found them from another. If it couldn't solve various of its problems, it found solutions. And so it renewed itself. It had the capacity until there were too many problems crashing in on them. And then there came the time when they couldn't anymore do it, and then slavery disappeared. The same is true for feudalism, and I believe the same is true for capitalism. Yes, it has had the capacity, but I would argue that what we are living through, and this is, in a way, I'm sorry to have to say it to young people, but if I'm going to be honest with you, there's nothing else I can say. You are coming of age at a time when the American capitalist system, the empire of the United States, has too many problems to solve. It can't. Look at the evidence We have been engaged in the last 40 years in 3 major wars: Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And the United States has been defeated in every one of them. You may not want to face this. You may not hear it on television because we are a country in deep denial, but the rest of the world sees it crystal clearly. Here's another example. For the last 100 years, roughly since the end of World War I, the United States has been the dominant capitalist power in the world. Nobody could compete. Not the British, whose colony we once were, not the Germans, who tried. The Russians were a political threat, but they were never an economic equal or an economic threat. But today, now, the United States has a real economic competitor. We haven't had that for a long time. We don't know how to handle it. We can't even face it, let alone handle it. And in case you're wondering, let me make sure you understand. It's called the People's Republic of China. And don't make any mistake, they are the equal militarily, economically, politically, culturally. In some cases more, in some cases less. But they are a world power with a few special qualities. For every American, there are 4 Chinese. Their population is 4 times or more than the United States. They are also a society that has demonstrated its ability to develop its technology on a scale no one foresaw, no one understood. The United States, for sure, didn't until now, when the development is too late. The genie is out of the box and nobody's going to put it back in. This is a whole new situation for the United States. The United States is the world's largest debtor country. No other country has borrowed more money from the rest of the world than the United States. And China is either number 1 or number 2 creditor country. It has lent money to the United States. Let me give you an example of what that means. China owns at least 1 trillion, maybe 2, of US debt. That means the United States government has borrowed from the Chinese government in excess of $1 trillion. When you borrow, you have to pay interest. Let's assume, just for simplicity, that the interest rate is 5%. And let's assume that China has lent the US only $1 trillion. That means the United States must pay interest to China every year of 5% on the trillion. That works out to $50 billion. And let me make it real clear. When you buy a can of beer, when you buy a pack of cigarettes, when you buy a tire for your car, you pay federal taxes. And part of the money you're paying is being picked up by Washington and delivered to Beijing for them to use to outcompete the United States. That's how the system is coming to an end. It cannot dictate to the rest of the world. It cannot afford to have super billionaires playing with rocket ships while it tries to win a war in Afghanistan and to compete with China. It's too many things it cannot do, and it doesn't have the political capacity to face it. That's why Republicans and Democrats fall all over themselves, threatening to go to war over Taiwan, or threatening to do something in another part of the world, or boasting the way they used to. They can't face that it's over. And the reality you're all going to have to face is that you're living in the end of an empire. And that is a very complicated moment of history for you to be, and me, to be living through. But it isn't going to help us by making believe none of that is happening. And this is not an endorsement of Xi Jinping or anything that the Chinese are doing. It's simply facing the reality. Over the last 70 years, the United States has provided foreign aid to most of the countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It never provided that kind of foreign aid to the People's Republic of China. But it's been the People's Republic of China that outdeveloped all the ones that got the aid. You have to understand that, or else you're living in a fantasy, and that usually ends badly.
I feel good with your answer. That now, what are real alternatives?
Good. I think there are two. The first alternative you're watching, and that's an alternative in which you have a system of employers and employees, what I would call a kind of capitalism, but not a private capitalism. There, the United States and Britain are the great examples. Britain is already an empire that's gone. They had one once. They're the example of where the United States is going, repeating what happened to England 50 to 100 years later. Private capitalism isn't working. A capitalism run by the government is what the Chinese have done. The Chinese learned from the United States that you need the government, and you need it all the time. And rather than pretending you don't, and rather than hobbling the government because you're afraid, what the Chinese have done is simply said, the government is running everything. You can have private capitalism, you can have private companies, but you're going to do it under the control of the central government. That's the Chinese model. And over the next 10 years, you're going to watch the United States either copy the Chinese or go down as a private capitalism that simply could not compete. Let me give you two statistics if the Chinese example strikes you. Over the last 30 years, the average rate of growth of the GDP, that's simply a number that reflects the total output of goods and services. So it's a measure of how well an economy is doing. It's a broad measure. It misses a lot, but it gives you a rough idea. Over the last 30 years, the average rate of growth of output of goods and services in the United States moved between 2 and 3% per year. Over the exact same 30 years, the average increase in the output of goods and services in the People's Republic of China averaged between 6 and 9%. Do you understand? China has demonstrated an economic growth rate 3 times that of the United States. That's why they caught up. That's why they're a competitor. And if these numbers remain, as most people who watch this stuff think they will, then China will surpass the output of the United States before the end of this decade. Here's your second number. Over the last 30 years, the real wages in the United States, that's the amount of money people get adjusted for the prices they have to pay, what the wage really allows you to buy, has been what we call in economics stagnant. Hasn't gone down, but hasn't gone up appreciably. It's flat. the same 30 years, the average real wage in China has quadrupled. There is no contest anymore. And the only reason Americans do not struggle with this information is because it is handled like the government of Portugal I told you about before. Americans don't know. They don't hear about it. They get a very selective, filtered news. They have political leaders that are basically cheerleaders for capitalism. Whoa, 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 look at our team. Aren't we wonderful? Okay, you want to go down that route, then you will continue to be surprised when history rears its head and bites you in the rear end.
Thank you.
Well, that was incredibly thorough. I think the last person that we have with their hand up is Gerard. Gerard, if you'd like to ask your question, feel free.
Do we have enough time, Jesse? Or
I guess I'll let Professor Wolff answer that. He's our guest of honor.
Yeah, I was trying to take it in a little bit of a different direction, Professor Wolff. Thank you for taking my question. Basically, I was looking at it. You talked about inequality, but more, in my understanding, at least more from a domestic perspective. And I just wonder about inequality on a global scale. And many of the countries that we're talking about that you spoke about belong to the North, in the North-South kind of nomenclature that we have. And many of them were also colonizers of the South. So there's a whole lot of complications there. In addition to that, we also look at the existential issue of climate change on the surface, but I think there are deeper environmental questions that are involved. And within all this context and all this complexity, it's obviously, my question is obviously sounding a little confused because there are so many different factors at play here. How do you see this moving forward? As for instance, in response to COP26 or during that time, there were many who called for climate change reparations, not just on racism and those kind of questions. So there's a huge lot of questions, even while we have almost 1 billion people who suffer from extreme poverty in the world and almost 1 billion people who suffer from extreme hunger in the world. And I was wondering how you would bring these on a global scale together.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful question. I agree with virtually everything that you said. If I had to give a summary sense that I have, I would say that the early European colonialism, when Europe literally carved up the rest of the world so that the British and the French and then all the others had their colonies, has been largely abandoned, but in favor of a kind of informal colonialism, neo-colonialism, which gives these countries a political independence, but no economic independence, basically at all. And whenever the issue is brought forward, you can see that the political independence they have really isn't worth very much. It does make a few individuals wealthy, but it doesn't change. And if you wanted the worst possible illustration, look at the numbers about COVID. Who has been given the vaccine? Who has not been given the vaccine? Who has been required to pay absurd amounts of money for the vaccine and therefore not been able to get it? You can see that the northern parts of the world literally are allowing vast numbers of people in the southern part to die or to get very ill, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, I think there would have to be, and for me as a socialist, which I am, in case any of you might have wondered, I would insist that socialism has been very varied. People who are socialists do not agree on a lot of things. They're no more simple-minded or all of one point of view than any other social movement. We have our differences. The Chinese call what they do socialism. I wouldn't call it that. You know, the Scandinavians call what they do socialism. I wouldn't call it that either. For me, socialism has to have the basis. And it has to have that worker co-op, because without the democratization of the workplace, all the other efforts, in my judgment, cannot come to fruition. But now to answer your question, I think there's a recognition which worker co-ops are easier able to arrive at than capitalist enterprises. There is has to be a recognition that in a world of extreme inequality, no one is safe, not just those at the bottom, but those at the top. I don't want to be mean-spirited, but there is something very powerful going on right now as the failure to provide the kind of healthcare in South Africa has led to a variant, this Omicron variant, that is coming back to the rest of the world. There is, if you pardon me, a poetic justice there that nobody dare miss. I think what you would have to have is a recognition by the world that there has to be a redistribution of jobs, of income, of wealth around the world, that the gaps between a wealthy North and a poverty-stricken South is not a tenable way forward. And that has to be addressed as just as urgent as any other issue, whether it's climate or the transition to worker co-ops or anything else. People have said this for a long time. The question is, can you develop an institutional structure where that question can be brought forward? And I think in a worker co-op, the same logic that says we're not going to give a supervisor vast wealth to play with, a la Elon Musk and Jeffrey Bezos, while other people, you know, cannot send their kid to college, cannot get enough food, cannot live in a, we're not going to do that. Well, if you're not going to do it in the family of workers at your workplace, why does the same logic not apply globally? That we're finally going to deal with this planet as the resource we all have to protect and share. Otherwise, we're going to be at each other in the future with the same horrible outcome that we've had in the past.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. I think for the most part, we're out of questions. I'm not sure if you have to go soon. I do have one, if you wouldn't mind me asking.
All right. Let me end with that one only because I have another talk to give, and you might enjoy that I'm giving a workshop to teachers of economics at the high school level in the People's Republic of China via Zoom. And it starts in about 15 minutes. So go ahead.
I think earlier in this talk, you mentioned how some European countries, I believe it was Germany, and talked about the Portugal government, but how some European countries have multiple main political parties. I was just wondering if that's something that you think should be defended or kept in countries that at least have multiple political parties. I know here in the US, especially because we have like a winner-take-all system with first past the post voting, where, you know, say you have 3 candidates and one person gets 40% of the vote and the other 2 candidates get 30 each. So the person who got the most votes wins, even though that's not the majority of voters. And so eventually, just over time, that kind of leads to a really, just stark political spectrum with the right and left, and ultimately just these two. I don't know what your thoughts are about, you know, countries with multiple political parties and how, if they should maintain it, how they can. I don't know if Germany has a majority voting system either, but and that was just something that kind of caught my attention.
Yes, I think it should. And let me be as blunt as I know how. If you are seriously committed to democracy, and if you are seriously committed to the freedom of choice, then you must support a political system that gives everybody a genuine opportunity to vote and gives you lots of choice. 6 parties, 8 parties, 10 parties. Let me be blunt with you. Americans are very happy that when they go into the drugstore, they have 27 kinds of toothpaste to choose among. You know, Colgate and Pepsodent, and this one has blue stripes, and that one has little red dots in it, and this one tastes like peppermint, and that one, you know, lots of choice. But when it comes to political parties, suddenly, no choice, just 2. Just 2. And those 2 work a monopoly. You know, we have laws in this country that make it illegal for a monopoly to exist in the economy. Do you want to explain to me why it is acceptable to have a monopoly in politics? If it's illegal in economics, it's at least as terrible in politics. And the Republicans and Democrats have everywhere made it impossible for other parties to get anywhere. They monopolize the money. They monopolize the relationship with the media. They put every bureaucratic obstacle in the way that you can think of. They do exactly what monopolists do in every field where a monopoly can get going. So I'm always amazed, and I provoke American audiences. You don't believe in competition. Stop lying. You don't want there to be lots of political parties competing, do you? You just want 2. How interesting a limited concept of competition you're endorsing. And now the other point that you made, Jesse, very important. This is the issue that's usually called proportional representation. Let me give you an example from Germany. Germany has 2, count them, 2 socialist parties. One is called the Socialist Party of Germany. That's the one that's now in power. That's the one that won the election 3 weeks ago. But they have a second one that's further to the left. It's called Die Linke, which in German means the left. It's the left party. So these 2 parties in Germany compete with a whole bunch of non-socialist parties. But under German law, and by the way, what I'm about to tell you is the law everywhere in Europe, you get as many seats in the parliament as you get a percentage of the popular vote. It's not winner take all. It's not if one party gets 51% and the other party gets 49%, the one with the 51% gets the seats, the Senate seat or the House of Representatives seat. They don't do that. You know why? Because in their mind, if 49% of the people didn't want this guy, then there ought to be 49% in the parliament working on the laws. Otherwise, you're not representing the people who vote. And stop pretending that you're doing that. So the Linke Party, which, for example, in the last election got about 5.5% of the vote, that's what they have in parliament, 5.5% of the seats. That's how it works. And they insist that's democratic. And what the United States does isn't. Now, you don't have to agree with them, but I'm not going to embarrass you by asking how many times in your education did a teacher dare tell you what I've just told you? Here's 2 different ideas of what is and isn't democratic, and what do you, as a young American student in my class, what do you think? And what are the pros and cons on both sides, or however you want to have it? We don't do that. We criticize the Soviet Union when it exists for not having balanced news. And that was fair, they didn't. But we don't either. And we haven't for a long time. And it means that all of us have to make use of this wonderful new resource, the internet. Because if you use it and you learn how to use it, you can find out. You can find out all about the Portuguese government or the German parliament or any other issue, just use it. But you must, because if you rely on mass media in the United States, you are getting a very lopsided, one-sided concept of what's going on anywhere, literally anywhere else in the world. You know, that other example I was going to give you before was from this area in Italy in the north around Bologna, big city in northern Italy. There's a province there in Italy called Emilia-Romagna. 40% of the 40% of the businesses in that province are worker co-ops. That area of Italy fiercely protects them. Nobody can mess with them. They've worked out an arrangement. 40% of the economy is worker co-op, 60% is the old capitalism. And people are free to choose. Young people can decide, I don't want to work in a top-down capitalist enterprise with a few bosses telling me what to do. I want to work in a democratic worker co-op. They have that choice, don't they? Americans, you don't have that choice. Nobody has developed a worker co-op sector of the United States, so each of us could go and look at it, see what it's like to work there, see what it's like to shop there, begin to make an informed decision as a population of what kind of economic system we want. We don't do that because the capitalists who own and operate the big media in this country don't wish us to, and so we don't. And you can only shake your head at the complicity of the reporters and the professors who actually know better, but keep quiet. Sadly, a number of them are my personal friends, and we have a tough time when we've had more than 2 beers. All right, folks, I have to go talk to my Chinese students. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for being interested. It's great to see a club like this functioning. I commend the faculty folks that are helping do this kind of thing, a very important part of education. I was honored by your invitation, and I hope you found it useful.
Professor Wolff, before you leave, we have something to say to you from our club. So,
yep. Thank you very much for staying. I don't even know how to express how we appreciate you staying longer for half an hour, 35 minutes. So on the behalf of the Board of Community College, City University of New York, the Department of Social Sciences, Human Services, and Criminal Justice, the Economics Program, and the Economics, Equality, and Environment Student Academic Club, our students and all of those in attendance today, thank you, Dr. Richard Wolff, for the enriching, enlightening, and engaging conversation you have provided us with during this economics seminar, which is the last in our fall 2021 seminar series. The topic, the crisis of U.S. capitalism and a solution, was thought-provoking and triggering and made clear how urgent is the need for a solution and a different economic system. Your outspoken and honest critique of the mainstream economic paradigm with its many flaws, illusions, and exclusions, and other complexities, and much more that you presented to us today in a way that was easy to understand, has given us a lot of food for thought, increased our awareness of economic issues facing the global economy, and more importantly, has energized us with a call to act to change the direction of the current mainstream economic paradigm. Your critique of U.S. capitalism and the solution you provide has enriched our learning and brings to the forefront the urgent need for a change in focus of economics as a discipline, the focus of economic policy, and much more that you bring to the field of economics. Your decades of work and experience with Marxian economics is so fascinating and very inspiring to us. We at BMCC are very honored and privileged to have had opportunity to engage in conversation with you today. And once again, we thank you deeply for giving us your time and even a little bit more than you promised us and this learning opportunity. We will thank everybody who helped to make this event possible, especially Professor Kenneth Levin, Professor Farias. we can also thank the other club executives, the president, Jesse Chen, me, the vice president, treasurer, Bernard Primicius, and secretary, Naomi Richards. We also want to thank the economics faculty who attended, who engaged made students to come to this event. It's Professor Bishop, Professor Sharma, Professor Ballardini, and a lot of other economic faculty in BMCC. Thank you to all the participants, especially our BMCC students, for attending today's talk and for your interesting questions. With this, our economics seminar for today and for the semester comes to a close. Be safe everywhere. Everyone, have a good rest of your day. Happy holidays. And we hope to see you in spring 2022.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again. It really was a pleasure. I'm glad I had the opportunity.